And I'm thrilled to be here because it gives me the chance to escape, even if only for a day, from the depressing state of British politics and our general election campaign. So at the moment, there is nothing more guaranteed to cheer Brits up about politics at home than coming to the United States. So my first point is that the news of the death of British parliamentary democracy has, in my view, been greatly exaggerated. And indeed, you can equally well argue that the recent stalemate we've had in our Parliament has showed that the House of Commons was working. When the executive ceased to function, individual MPs stepped forward, as they're supposed to do, to try to fill the vacuum. So if that's Parliament, what's going on in the country at large? And I would describe the overwhelming feeling in Britain about Brexit not as one of rage, but as one of boredom. And that, of course, is a much more typical British reaction. People are fed up with talking about it. It's, of course, precisely that mood which Boris Johnson is trying to tap into with his campaign slogan of "Get Brexit Done." So what about the talk that you may have seen about the emergence of some new centre party grouping in the UK? You might have read about a new party called Change UK, and it is true that some Conservative and Labour MPs have joined the Liberal Democrats or become independents. Well, Change UK lasted about a week before it started splintering into warring subgroups. And so far, one of the themes of our general election has been that, far from increasing, support for the Lib Dems, our third party, who should theoretically be well placed to benefit from people switching away from the extremes, support for the Lib Dems has actually been squeezed between growing support for the two main parties. So my best guess is that if the Conservative Party wins the election with a working majority, the British Parliament will settle down pretty quickly. And it's only if the election delivers another unclear result, another hung Parliament, that a more fundamental realignment in British politics would become more likely. So if my first point is that the UK is more resilient than we might look from the outside, it's nevertheless true that in the 3.5 years now since our referendum in June 2016, we have certainly got ourselves into a political mess. So how did that happen? And I'd say that there were three main reasons. There was a lack of honesty, a lack of leadership, and a lack of numbers. On honesty, it was always clear that we could not leave the EU, having spent 40 years consciously integrating ourselves into it without there being disruption and some economic and political pain. When you make changes in politics, there are always winners and losers. And this was the biggest set of changes we'd made in nearly half a century. So, of course, there were always going to be plenty of both. But at the heart of the election is going to be Brexit. And here, I believe, the Conservatives have the advantage of a much clearer proposition, which seems to me to be nearer to the public mood. The choice, or at least the choice as framed by the Conservatives, is that Boris Johnson will get Brexit done, whereas with Labour, you'll have another delay, another renegotiation, and two more referendums, one on the EU, another on Scotland, with a dose of Marxism thrown in for good measure. Now, as things stand, there are only two possible outcomes. There are Conservative victory or another hung parliament where no one party wins a majority, but where the Labour Party is likely to be the second biggest party, the Scottish Nationalists and the Liberal Democrats come to some kind of arrangement. Of the two at the moment, if you go on the national opinion polls, the more likely result seems to be a Conservative victory. Their lead in the opinion polls has been pretty stable now throughout the campaign for 3 weeks at between 10 to 12 points. If anything, it's slightly nudging up. So I just want to say something now, look forward to what might happen after December the 12th. Because depending on the result, I see two very distinct paths. One that takes the UK further away from the EU and closer to the US, and one that keeps us closer to the EU and further away from the US. If the Conservatives do win, the first thing that will happen, Boris Johnson will pass his withdrawal agreement he negotiated with the EU. I think that will pass very swiftly. It'll be done early in the new year. But even if that is correct, that does not mean that Brexit is all done and dusted. Because what the withdrawal agreement sets out is the terms on which the UK will leave the EU. The question of our future relationship with the EU, which is the much more important and difficult issue about our trading relationship with the EU, that still lies ahead. Personally, I believe that the logic of Brexit, reinforced by commitments that have been made by the Prime Minister and his colleagues during the election campaign, will take us down the route of diverging from the EU. And I say that as someone who, during the referendum, campaigned for Remain. So I'm going to stick my neck out and end with some predictions, where I hope you will be generous and only remember the ones that I get right. Boris Johnson will win the general election. Britain will leave the EU. The EU will integrate further and become more protectionist. Over this coming year, the UK will be forced to choose between the EU and the US. And under Boris Johnson, we will end up choosing the open seas. Now, over the last 40 years, the UK has done a brilliant juggling act, managing to maintain a relationship with both the US and the EU as a bridge between the two to the advantage of both. My view is that one day we were going to have to make a choice of this kind in any case. But Brexit and Mr. Trump have brought the date of that choice forward. And next year is the year that the UK is going to have to choose.
And I think I always find it incredibly interesting when you talk about how the practice of politics has changed in terms of how people work together and the time they make to really connect. I mean, could you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think that is relevant to some of the challenges we face now.
I do. So I think in essence, I mean, this is not a kind of startling insight, but the speed of politics has accelerated massively from when I started in the mid-1980s. And some of that is technological, and some of that is practice and behavior. So to take an extreme example, when I started, I had a shorthand typist. Didn't have a mobile phone. The internet hadn't been developed. Or perhaps some clever person was developing it, but we weren't using it. And so what that meant was firstly the process of government, the process of politics, it was more structured and ordered. So before I had to put in a note to my Secretary of State or the Prime Minister, I had to think through what I wanted to say before I committed it to paper through my shorthand typist. And so what we have nowadays, much more, I think, everything is an unfinished conversation. It doesn't really have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I've seen when I went back into government 30 years later, government was being carried out by text. So everything was much faster, much smaller, that there's been much more centralisation in the way that government is carried out in the UK. And this notion has taken root, I mean, I would date it to 1997 was the big change when Mr. Blair came in, that you've got to get ahead of the media the whole time on every story. And the speed of response or announcement is much more important than the substance. So I remember saying to one of the clever, bright young men, and they were all young men at Number 10 under Mr. Cameron, don't you think it would be a good idea to slow down a little bit? You don't have to rush out a statement immediately. Don't you think it would be sensible to think what you're trying to achieve, and let's work out our strategy? And, he said to me, well, you don't understand how anything works anymore, and this is how it has to be. And I do understand how it works. I mean, what it has led to is a diminution in the quality of decision-making, hysterical media coverage that is impossible really for anyone to take seriously. If you look at our election at the moment, one of the things that strikes me compared with the 92 election, where I ran John Major's election, was that now politicians can say things that I would have considered 25 years ago were huge stories in a developing campaign, either a mistake or an announcement, and they just drop like a pebble without a splash into the water. They've gone in a couple of hours. The Labour Party announced a 32-hour week, and then they said it would cover the whole economy, and then they said it wouldn't cover the health service, and then they said it would cover the health service. So in old money, this would have been a massive moment in an election campaign that you would plough in and you would use to accentuate your political story. It had gone within 2 hours. And so I think this problem I think the public discern that our politics has become infantilized and is not serious. Whatever form that takes in our countries, it has different manifestations. I mean, you have a manifestation, we have a manifestation. The public know this is not right. And it's eroding trust in the political system, I think. And I think the other thing, to your question about relationships and connections, which is what we try and do at Ditchley, I've seen, certainly between Britain and the EU, the number and quality and depth of our relationships between British politicians and European politicians has been reducing probably over a 7 to 10 year period. In the last 3.5 years, it has shriveled almost to zero. No, I'm exaggerating, but very few European politicians any longer come to Britain. European commissioners, which I used to be one, they used to come to London the whole time. I mean, we're getting 2 or 3 a year. So this means that people don't know how to pick the phone up to each other. They don't understand each other. They don't know what they're thinking. The European side is forming their view of what's happening in Britain from what they read in the Financial Times, The Guardian, and on the BBC website, which, excellent publications though they are, do not present a rounded picture of what's happening in Britain. So I think this point that I know you are very focused on with Ditchley as being a place where Britain, for instance, can try and rebuild relationships with the EU, but also with our friends in the US, I think is vital to how we get our politics working better again.